It was February of 1916 when we first crawled into the trenches outside Verdun. They told us it would be a quick push, nothing more than another skirmish in a long war. But the shelling never stopped, the mud swallowed men whole, and we began to realize this place wasn't a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse that didn't let go of its dead. We were a squad of 9 when we arrived, boots crunching over frozen ground already stained darker than any soil should be. The air reeked of rot, smoke, and the faint chemical bite of gas that never seemed to drift far enough away. We'd been in bad places before, but Verdun was different. The moment we climbed down into those trenches, we felt it, like the ground itself was heavier, pressing down on us, watching. At first, we tried to laugh it off. Soldiers always joked, always found ways to spit in death's face, even when shells were landing close enough to rattle our bones. But as the days bled into nights, the laughter grew scarce. The walls of the trench weren't just earth. They were bodies, arms, legs, twisted bones poking out from the mud where new soil had been thrown on top of the old. We couldn't tell where one grave ended and the next began. We stopped asking questions. At night, when the shelling paused and we dared to breathe, the silence was worse. It wasn't the calm of a world at rest. It was heavy, suffocating, alive with whispers we couldn't place. Sometimes it sounded like the wind threading through the gaps in the wood planks. Other times, it sounded like voices, low, muffled, as if the earth itself had something to say. One night, while we crouched with rifles clutched and eyes on the black sky, Henri swore he saw a movement in the mud wall beside him. A hand, just for a second, pale, slick, and reaching upward before vanishing back into the trench wall like it had never been there. We told him it was nerves, exhaustion, too many days without real rest. But none of us slept easy after that. The rats didn't help. They grew fat on what Verdun fed them, bold enough to run across our chests as we tried to sleep, fearless even when we swung at them with knives. We joked that the rats would outlive us all, inheriting the trenches when every man was gone. But in quiet moments, when they scattered all at once, it felt like they knew something we didn't, that something else was down there with us, moving in the dark. The Germans were relentless, yes. Their artillery screamed day and night, tearing men to pieces so fast we sometimes didn't even find bodies, just scraps of uniform hanging from the wire. But we began to fear the lulls more than the barges. In the quiet, when the guns stopped, and even the night birds dared not sing, the trenches seemed to breathe. The ground shifted, the walls creaked, though no weight pressed against them. And in that unnatural stillness, we felt eyes on us. We started to keep count of who woke screaming. It wasn't the shells that did it. It was dreams, dreams so vivid they clung to us, even when we forced our eyes open. We dreamed of being buried alive, of drowning in mud, of hearing comrades call our names from beneath the earth. Sometimes, we dreamed of our mothers, our wives, our children, but their mouths were filled with soil, and when they opened them, only worms crawled out. One morning, just before dawn, we found Jules sitting at the edge of the trench, staring at nothing. His rifle lay forgotten in the mud, and when we asked what he was doing, he only said, "They're calling us." His eyes were hollow, his lips cracked from cold. We shook him, shouted at him, slapped him until his teeth rattled, but his gaze stayed fixed on the far side of no man's land, on the mist rising above cratered ground where hundreds of men already lay. He didn't last the week. We told ourselves it was nerves, exhaustion, the grind of endless fighting. But deep down, we knew the truth. Verdun was eating us alive. Every letter we wrote home felt like the last. Every bite of stale bread tasted like dirt. And every night, when the guns finally fell silent, we heard them again, the whispers crawling through the trench like smoke. Sometimes they sounded like our fallen brothers, their voices broken but familiar, urging us to lay down our rifles, to rest. Other times, they were harsher, darker, like voices we were never meant to understand. We tried to pray, but even the prayers felt swallowed, as if God's voice couldn't reach that place. We were cut off, abandoned, forgotten in the grinder. And as February bled into March, we realized something far worse than dying out there. We realized Verdun didn't just want our lives. It wanted our souls. We stopped marking the days. Time in Verdun bled together, one bombardment into the next, one burial into another. The only thing that changed was the faces around us. And even those vanished so quickly we barely had time to remember them. A replacement would climb into the trench at dawn, wide-eyed, boots too clean. By nightfall, he'd be gone. Sometimes in pieces, sometimes without a trace at all. We told ourselves the missing had been blown apart, swallowed by shell fire, scattered so fine across no man's land we'd never find them. That was the rational answer, and we clung to it. But when you see a man only an arm's reach away one moment and gone the next, no explosion, no shout, no sound at all, you start to wonder. And the trench walls didn't help. Every time we dug, every time we tried to shore up the mud with timber, the earth gave back pieces of men who'd been there long before us. Helmets crushed into skulls, fingers curled tight around rusted rifles, faces half-rotted but still locked in screams. Some nights we swore those same faces looked different the next morning, as though they'd shifted while we slept. Henri was the first to lose his nerve completely. One night, during a lull, he started clawing at the trench wall, bare hands digging in the mud, nails tearing bloody. We pulled him off, shouting, demanding to know what he was doing. He only screamed, "They're trapped. Can't you hear them? They're calling for air." His voice cracked, and he sobbed like a child until we tied his wrist to keep him from tearing himself apart. We told ourselves it was madness, the strain of battle. But when the night fell silent again, and the smoke lifted just enough for us to breathe, we did hear something. A faint sound in the mud, beneath the shifting weight of soil. Scraping, knocking, like fingernails against wood, muffled by layers of earth. We didn't sleep. The next day, command ordered us to push forward through a section of trench we called the Hollow. None of us wanted it. That place felt wrong, even by Verdun standards. Darker, colder, the mud thicker, clinging to our boots like it meant to drag us under. The stench was unbearable, worse than gas, worse than decay. Some of us gagged into our scarves. Inside the Hollow, the walls narrowed, suffocatingly close, the kind of place where you felt you couldn't turn your head without brushing bone. We moved single file, rifles raised, hearts hammering. And that's when Jules, no, not Jules, he was gone weeks ago. It was Mark this time. Mark swore he saw someone walking ahead of us. A soldier, French uniform, same as ours. Only his head was down, and when we called, he didn't answer. We hurried forward, boots sloshing, but when we reached the spot, nothing. Just mud and mist curling where he'd been. Mark wouldn't speak the rest of the night. We tried to shake it off. Hallucinations were common. We told ourselves. The gas, the exhaustion, the fear, your mind played tricks. But the thing about tricks is they don't leave footprints. And there in the mud, leading deeper into the Hollow, we saw them. Clear as our own. Boot prints, fresh, glistening with water. Only they ended against the trench wall, disappearing into solid earth. That night, the whispers grew louder. They weren't muffled anymore. They were closer, clearer, rising from beneath us like breath through the planks. We huddled together, rifles clutched tight, every man wide-eyed. Some voices we recognized, comrades who'd fallen days before, calling us by name. Others we didn't. Harsh tones, foreign words, voices that made our stomachs twist. And then came the laughter. Not the laughter of men, but something higher, sharper, echoing through the Hollow as if the very trench mocked us. We covered our ears, but it wasn't enough. It was inside our skulls, rattling through our teeth. One of us fired his rifle in a mud wall, just to make it stop. For heartbeat, it worked. Silence fell. But in the smoking crater left by a shot, we saw something we'd never forget. An eye, pale and unblinking, staring back at us before the mud collapsed to cover it. We didn't speak of it after. Some of us pretended it hadn't happened. Others crossed themselves until their fingers bled. But we all knew Verdun wasn't just killing men. It was taking them, holding them, keeping them close. By dawn, 3 of us were gone. No gunfire, no explosions, just gone. We searched every corner of the Hollow, every mound, every stretch of mud where they might have fallen. Nothing, only their rifles left behind, barrels wet with fresh earth. We weren't a squad of 9 anymore. We were 6, and Verdun was still hungry. We were 6 now, 6 left to hold a stretch of trench that felt less like a defense and more like a grave dug in advance. Every time one of us disappeared, the space they left behind seemed to press in on the rest of us, as if the trench itself was shrinking, eager to close over what remained. By then, none of us trusted the silences. Shelling, machine gun fire, the roar of planes overhead. Those were normal. Those we could live with. It was when the battlefield went still that our hands trembled, when we tightened our grips on the rifles and whispered prayers we weren't sure anyone was listening to. Because that's when the voices came back. They didn't whisper anymore. They spoke clearly, rising from the walls, drifting in from the darkness of no man's land. They called us by name, each of us, in voices we recognized. Pierre swore he heard his brother, did a year already in the Marne. Henri wept when he heard his mother's voice, clear and soft, asking him to come home. We told ourselves it was tricks of memory, exhaustion breaking our minds, but none of us could explain how they knew the words, the tones, the private things only our dead could have known. We tried to drown them out, sang old marching songs in ragged unison, clapping, shouting, anything to block the sound. But the voices grew louder, closer, until the mud itself seemed to vibrate with them. One night, the ground began to shake as if another barrage was coming down. We ducked low, helmets tight, waiting for the shells to tear us apart. But none came. The rumbling wasn't in the sky. It was beneath us. The trench floor heaved, mud splitting in jagged cracks. For a moment, it looked like hands pushing up through the soil, dozens of them, clawing for air. We froze, every muscle locked, watching as the ground writhed like it was alive. And then, just as suddenly it stilled, the cracks filled with black water. The hands were gone. We didn't speak of it, not aloud, but we all knew what we'd seen. The next morning, Andre didn't wake. His body was still there, curled against the trench wall, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. His lips were blue, his skin gray, but there wasn't a mark on him. No wound, no blood. Just gone, as if something had slipped inside during the night and pulled the life out of him without leaving a trace. We buried him shallow, because the ground was too hard to dig deep. We didn't pray. We didn't dare. That left 5. By then, none of us slept if we could help it. We took turns, 2 men on watch while the others sat huddled, eyes darting at every shadow. The rats had grown worse. They didn't scatter anymore. They lingered, staring at us with wet black eyes, teeth chattering like they were laughing. We threw rocks, swung knives, but more always came. Pierre muttered that they weren't rats at all, but messengers, feeding on more than just the dead. Then came the night we lost Henri. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound like a drum. We sat in the dark, rifles across our knees, breath fogging in the cold. Henri was beside me, muttering to himself, fingers working at the strap of his rifle like he couldn't sit still. Then he stopped, his head tilted, listening to something none of us heard. Slowly, without a word, he stood and began walking toward the trench wall. We hissed his name, reached to grab him, but he moved too fast. He pressed his hands to the mud, leaned close like he was listening, and whispered something back. Before we could stop him, he dropped his rifle and pushed forward into the wall. Not climbing, not digging, just sinking. The earth seemed to open around him, swallowing him chest deep, then to his shoulders. His face twisted between fear and relief, and then he was gone. The mud sealed over as if he'd never stood there at all. We clawed at the spot until our fingers bled, screaming his name, tearing away chunks of dirt and rock. Nothing. Not a shred of uniform. Not a trace of blood. Only mud, heavy and cold, pressing back against us like it wanted to keep him. That left 4. After that, the trench never felt empty. Even when we huddled close, even when we counted each other again and again to be sure, there was always a sense that someone else was there with us. A shadow at the edge of vision. A breath too many in the dark. Boots sloshing in mud just behind us when no one moved. We were 4 men left alive in Verdun, and we knew the truth now. This place didn't belong to France or to Germany. It didn't belong to the living at all. It belonged to the dead, and they were hungry. The trench no longer felt like ours. It breathed when we did, shifted when we moved, and every step we took sank deeper into its grip. We weren't soldiers holding a line anymore. We were intruders trespassing in a place that belonged to the dead. Sleep had abandoned us. We sat with eyes open, staring into the dark, afraid that if we closed them, we'd never open them again. The nights were worst. The air grew colder, heavy with a dampness that clung to our skin, and in that suffocating stillness the voices rose louder, no longer whispers but chants, layered and endless, like the ground itself was singing. Pierre was the first to answer them. He stood in the middle of the night, rifle clutched to his chest, and began to hum along. At first we thought it was nerves, some broken habit to keep his mind intact. But then he smiled, a soft, empty smile none of us had seen on him before. Without a word, he walked forward into the mist. We lunged to grab him, but the fog thickened like a curtain, and by the time it lifted, Pierre was gone. That left 3. Mark lasted longer, but barely. His mind frayed thread by thread, until he started carving crosses into the wood with his bayonet, over and over, muttering prayers that twisted into curses. When the trench wall buckled and mud poured in around him, he didn't fight. He laughed. The earth swallowed him waist deep, chest deep, until the mud reached his chin. His last words were not to us, but to whatever waited below. "I'm ready." Then the ground sealed over. That left 2. We avoided each other's eyes after that, as if we feared seeing the same hunger that had taken the others staring back at us. We didn't speak. We didn't move unless forced. The trench had grown narrower, tighter, like the walls were closing in. The rats had abandoned us. Even the birds above the battlefield had gone. Only silence remained, and the steady beat of something beneath our boots. On the final night, the silence shattered. The trench shook, wood splintered, mud rained from above. The sound that rose up around us wasn't gunfire or shelling. It was a roar, 1,000 voices crying out at once. The earth split open, a black maw tearing through the floor, wide enough to swallow us whole. The man beside me, my last brother in that cursed trench, reached for me, eyes wild with terror. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear his words over the roar. And then the floor gave way. He dropped screaming into the dark, his cry cut short as the mud folded over him. I was alone, faces pressed out of the walls, pale and slick, their mouths open in laughter, in hunger, in grief. Hands clawed at me, dragging me down into the crack. The mud rose past my knees, my waist, my chest. I fought, I clawed, but the trench had decided. Verdun had decided. The last thing I saw before the earth swallowed me whole were the eyes of the dead, staring, unblinking, waiting for me to join them. And then, nothing.